では、再びマイクのチェックを行っております。はい、マイクのテストを行っております。なんか、ずっと喋り続ける感じにしたいですね。いかがですか？音は聞こえない。ラグがやっぱありますね。はい、マイクのテストを行っております。なんか、
ずっと喋り続ける。
そうですね。
はい。
ちょっとずっと
皆さん
喋り続けていきたいと思います。
大丈夫ですかね。これで聞こえてますかね。で僕はちょっと座ってみますので、ちょっとカメラいろいろちょっとチェックとかもやってみてください。はい。かなりこれタイムラグがかなりあるんだよ。どうも、皆さんこんにちは。今日は、あれとかいろいろで、これマイクをね、マイクじゃないカメラ今いろいろ変わります。すごいんですよ。これは、タイムラグがかなりあるんですよね。
ズームウェビナーだとここまでないですけど、
ああ、なるほど。
YouTube ライブだとどうしても。
はい。皆さん、どうも、こんにちは。
なんか邪魔ってことですね。
そうです、そうです。向こうで宮田君が全部やってくれるんで。なんと言いますか、今日は、大変ですね。皆さん、本当にお疲れ様です。トラブル続きときましたけれども、はい。そうか。これは配信されてるのか。じゃあ、まあ、大丈夫ですね。じゃあ別に何もトラブルはなくて、いや、正解順にも配信されてしまいました。はい。まあ、別に大丈夫。でも8人が視聴中というふうになってた。8人、8人の方に内情が、じゃあちょっと一回、これで大丈夫ということね。はい。はい。
今はですね、PDF の方を、画面共有していただきました。
Maybe, no, he will give a... Oh. So, maybe it's the time. So now we get started. Okay. Welcome to the symposium, Philosophy and Ethics for New Enlightenment. This event is held by EAA, East Asian Academy for New Liberal Arts, and supported by the UTCP and the University of Tokyo Center for Philosophy. I am Koichiro Kokubun, the professor of philosophy here in Komababa University of Tokyo. And now, today, we welcomed a very, very special guest, Marcus Gabriel. Please welcome him. And we are supposed to welcome Christian Woo-pen, Dr. Christian Woo-pen, but she's now coming. She's in the train, so she will show up. And next to me, O Sensei, please welcome him. He will give a talk, and we also invited斎藤幸平Sensei, but she is now sick in bed. So sorry. Please pray for him. I hope he will recover very, very soon. So firstly, I would like to ask Ishii Sensei, the director of EAA, to give an opening remark for this event. So, お願いいたします。
Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry for my late coming because I had a class just before the symposium started. So anyway, I'm Tsuyoshi Ishii, and this is my greatest honor to invite Professor Marcus Gabriel, and maybe Professor Christian Woo-pen will be coming soon, and to hold a symposium entitled Philosophy and Ethics for New Enlightenment here at Komaba campus of the University of Tokyo. My name is Tsuyoshi Ishii, professor of Chinese philosophy, and currently director of East Asian Academy for New Liberal Arts, as Koichiro introduced just before. It's called EAA of University of Tokyo. EAA is co-organizing this symposium with UTCP, University of Tokyo Center for Philosophy, to which I belong as well. Borrowing this opportunity, please allow me to introduce EAA briefly on behalf of the Academy. As its name suggests, EAA is aiming at developing new liberal arts, which is based on East Asian perspective. Specifically, we are jointly steering undergraduate education program with Peking University. The reason why we are focusing on liberal arts is because Komaba is a campus that has a long tradition of liberal arts. The main body of Komaba campus is called Kyoyo Gakubu, which we translate into College of Arts and Sciences. Kyoyo is a term invented around 100 years ago in Japan, inspired by a German word, Bildung. We have had a long history of debate, inquiring what kind of wisdom we were willing to implement under the name of Kyoyo. Eventually, people in Komaba today reached some kind of mild consensus that liberal arts should be scholarship, which we have to seek here in Komaba. And I believe that liberal arts should actually be equal to what Immanuel Kant meant by philosophy in his essay, De illustrate der Fakultäten, or the dispute of faculties. Therefore, EAA as an institute located in Komaba is actually trying to develop new philosophy in a broader sense. Thank you for coming.
クリスチャン・ウペさん。
So yeah, now I give my speech. Yes. So we are now, EAA is now actually trying to develop new philosophy in a broader sense under the name of East Asian New Liberal Arts. And in this respect, the notion of philosophy that developed in the 18th century Germany seems to provide us with a rich imagination. Christian Wolff, by whom Kant was so much influenced, following Christian Thomasius in the late 17th century, understood philosophy as Weltweisheit, or wisdom of the world. And that was one of the starting points of the Enlightenment movement in Germany. How do we understand the world? This is precisely the core inquiry of philosophical practice. And moreover, how should we be better human is the question, which is necessarily and inevitably integrated together with the question toward the world. Wolff elaborated the notion of Weltweisheit to emphasize that importance of Verstand, or understanding in English. As we are very much familiar, Kant gave a new role to the concept of Verstand. That is to say, the key energy for people to enlighten themselves. Kant invited us to have the courage to use our own understanding. Undoubtedly, this is the very motto, core motto of enlightenment in modern times. But here comes some sort of contingency. How did these series of notions surrounding enlightenment emerge at that time? It is commonly believed that the Enlightenment movement in the 18th century was generated in the Western world and penetrated into other regions across the world as an important element of modernity. However, we should not forget that Christian Wolff got inspired by Chinese thought. He made a speech in 1721, which was entitled On Practical Philosophy of Chinese at Harvard University. In this speech, he emphasized that it was possible for humans to be morally good without divine or revelational religiosity. As you know, the speech caused to his resignation as a professor of Harvard University, because he was accused of an atheist. However, it was him who articulated the significance of human understanding independent from divine authority. And such an idea actually came from Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucian philosophy. If we see a resonance between Wolff's discourse and Kantian notion of enlightenment, it could be said that Kantian enlightenment was not purely European thought, but an accomplishment of global human network at that time. Of course, I'm not intending to emphasize how Chinese or Oriental thought played an important role as an origin of the Enlightenment movement. I want to reject falling into such a dichotomous juxtaposition of West and East. We have to get rid of such a way of binary thinking. But let me say a little more about East Asian situation. Okay. I would like to point out of the difficulty of enlightenment in East Asian tradition. In Japan, Onishi Hajime, philosopher in the 19th century, regretted the Enlightenment movement in Meiji Japan was easily overcome by anti-Enlightenment thought of historicism and nationalism. Japanese imperialism in the early 20th century apparently played a role of suppressing Enlightenment movement in East Asian nations, and the aftermaths are still seen everywhere, including Japan itself, still now. So, in my view, enlightenment is yet to be achieved in this area, although Wolff and other philosophers borrowed East Asian thought to develop the notion of enlightenment. I guess that Onishi Hajime was not comfortable to see Japanese Enlightenment movement in the early Meiji period was just a process of importing foreign way of thinking that seemed advanced for Meiji Japanese intellectual. In that context, Enlightenment turned to be an attitude, learning from the West. This is opposite to the spirit of Enlightenment. In China, their situation was different from Japanese one. According to Encyclopedia of Enlightenment Thoughts, this is recently published in Japan, in which I also contributed an item on enlightenment in the 20th century China. Enlightenment movement in Chinese modern time took place at least 4 times. They have been tackling against each historical condition with an intellectual endeavor. However, it is often disrupted by another massive power of historically emerging momentum. Both the Western impact and Japan's invasion to China were the most influential powers, causing transformations of Enlightenment movements in the early 20th century. The May 4th New Culture movement in 1910s and 1920s should be designated as the most important Enlightenment movement in modern China. However, because this movement was partly originated from the protest against Western imperialism. So some scholars see it as an Enlightenment movement as anti-Enlightenment. This is one aspect of Chinese Enlightenment movement. And from 1930s, Japanese militarism began invasion to China. The Enlightenment movement in 1920s in China was overcome by anti-invasion movement. Li Zehou, who is a distinguished philosopher in China, who passed away just 2 years ago, expressed this historical turn in China as saving the nation overwhelmed enlightenment. So in short, they have been connecting the notion of enlightenment with another notion of human liberation. Japanese imperialism and its aftermath seem somehow overshadowing East Asian nations until nowadays, let alone the Cold War thinking dominating this region for so many years. In this sense, we may say that enlightenment is yet to be realized, not only in China, but also in Japan. Of course, we need to enlighten ourselves, but it is not an easy task. In the example of Wolff and Kant in the 18th century, at least we can see one possible way for us to foster enlightenment. That is precisely global interaction among various wisdoms. Or in other words, we have to reinterpret the notion of Weltweisheit, world wisdom, in a way that could accommodate to today's condition. Encountering the others will open up a door to enlightenment. This is a commonly seen fact when we look back into our history. I am delightful to be witnessing that a new collaboration between German institutes led by Professor Gabriel and scholars in University of Tokyo has just been launched. Today's conversation is also a part of it. I'm very much looking forward to listening to their discussion with Professor Gabriel and Professor Woo Pen. That would be more than exciting and fruitful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ishii Sensei, for his remark, wonderful opening remark. Yes, now we are here in Kyoyo Gakubu of University of Tokyo. That means the Department of Liberal Arts. So I've just noticed, thanks to Ishii Sensei, that our today's subject, the Enlightenment, is very close to some kind of ideal of our department, right? So it's a really wonderful opening remark. So I should have said that this symposium is now being filmed by the German TV and the NHK. So please accept that. Okay? You okay? So sorry, I should have said so. So and now Dr. Christian Woo Pen shows up. Please welcome her. Very nice to meet you, and welcome to Komaba at the University of Tokyo. So, as I said, Kohei-san is absent. So, I'm as a moderator, I am confronted with a big problem. How do I manage the 2-hour symposium? Well, we will have spare time. Maybe. So, in fact, Christian sent me if I may, Christian sent me a very nicely written, very nicely structured text you have as a printed. And one sensei sent me a very interesting essay, and Marx didn't send me anything. So in my today's lunchtime break, I wrote a very short text to because Kohei-san isn't here. Maybe this will be a overview to today's subject, that is enlightenment. So please allow me to speak first before you three. The title of today's symposium is Philosophy and Ethics for New Enlightenment. New Enlightenment. Enlightenment is our subject. What an interesting and risky subject, right? Why is it interesting and risky? Here in the University of Tokyo, I am employed to teach and research philosophy. So as a philosophy teacher and researcher, I thought following things. The word enlightenment reminds me of course, a very famous essay of Immanuel Kant. Of course, what is enlightenment? That was written in 1784. It means in the second half of the 18th century. This Kantian essay opens in the following way. It is a very, very well-known sentences. Today, I invited so many my Japanese students, so I quote the Kantian essay in English and Japanese. Sorry. So the firstly, the English translation. This is how Kantian essay starts. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority, self-imposed knowledge, minority, is inability to make use of one's own understanding without direction from another. This knowledge minority is self-imposed. If its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in this indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Sapere aude, dare to be wise, have courage to make use of your own understanding. This is the motto of enlightenment. ちょっと絵本の訳もちょっと読みますと、啓蒙とは人間が自ら招いた未成年状態から抜け出ることだ。未成年状態、minority, knowledge。未成年状態とは他人の指導なしには自分の知性を用いる能力がないことである。この未成年状態の原因が五性の欠如にではなくて、他人の指導がなくても自分の五性を用いる決意と勇気の欠如にあるなら、未成年状態の責任は本人にある。したがって、啓蒙の標語は、あえて賢くあれ、自分自身の五性を用いる勇気を持てである。っていうのがカントのエッセイなんですね。This is an extremely inspiring text, which has been repeatedly read and interpreted. For example, for me, Michel Foucault's reading was very, very interesting. But there always remains a problem, a crucial problem. The problem is, what does the word minority or nonage means? 未成年が何を意味するかね。I do not delve deeper into the Kantian essay, of course. But it is true that the image of being a minor in this context have been, for a long time, that of being non-Occidental or non-European. Is it the fault of the word Enlightenment itself? Is it impossible to separate the concept of Enlightenment from so-called European universalism? The answer is open. But according to my view, skeptical attitude to Enlightenment became stronger in the second half of the 20th century. And in my view, it culminated in the so-called multiculturalism in the 1990s. Then, in 1990s, I was an undergraduate student in political sciences, not in philosophy. And I do remember how strong the multicultural methodology was in that field, in the political sciences. And Enlightenment was one of the terms criticized by the multiculturalism as a concept of European-centered universalism. But maybe in the first decade of 21st century, maybe I can call a backlash emerged. For example, there was a criticism against the multiculturalism, saying that the multiculturalism was used to justify some kind of violations of human rights. My position is very close to those who criticize the multiculturalism in this way. I think at least in 1990s, multiculturalism, of course, there are so many multiculturalism, but in general, multiculturalism was a kind of disguised conservatism. Multiculturalism worked as a safe place for conservatives. You may also refer to some academic contributions in this direction. For example, I can quote a controversial book of Jonathan Israel on what he calls radical enlightenment, which stressed on the important role of radical movement in the history of liberation of people. And according to him, Spinoza played a very important role, and Spinoza is my specialty. I like Spinoza, and so in a sense, I agree to him. And now, more than 20 years have already passed since we welcomed 21st century. In 2023, we are now, right? We are confronted with great difficulties I have to be very careful in mentioning to these difficulties, but I dare say that if I take a look at what is going on in the internet, for example, it is as if we came back to the era before the Enlightenment, post-truth, fake news, conspiracy theory. It is really catastrophic, right? So I am skeptical about simple universalism, of course, but as well as a simple multiculturalism. Well, how do we conceptualize a new enlightenment in this context? I close my remark by asking this question. So this is my this is text I wrote because Kohei is absent here. So firstly, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Christian Woo-Pen. She sent me a very, very nicely written text, and you have as a printed, right? Okay. And yes, I forgot to notice that this symposium is now being broadcasted through the internet. That's okay, you know? Okay. So I will now give you the floor, Christian. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your very nice welcome. And I'm so sorry for having been late, but I am the first time in Tokyo in my life, and I used the trains the last 2 or 3 days, and it went perfectly. And I thought, well, I'm a professional in using trains in Tokyo, but then today everything turned out to be different because there were different train lines. I need new tickets, and so I'm so sorry that I'm late, but I made it. And I thank you so much to having me invited here to this exciting symposium, to these days in Tokyo. And I am very happy to meet you and to discuss with you and to engage in these important ideas on the new Enlightenment, because it's us who shape the world now. So let's talk about it. Because I thought Marcus would go deep into philosophy, and I have a lot of experience in policy advice, and I thought it would be a good thing to focus on the dialogue between science, technology, and policy advice, and have a look at what ethics can do in this area. And that's why I called my talk The Dialogue Between Science, Technology, and Public Policies Towards a New Enlightenment of the Publics. So we are discussing a new enlightenment, and let me firstly say, I don't think that enlightenment will come only from using reason. Yeah, because I have another understanding of the human being. It's not to get rid of reason, of course not, but I differ a bit from Kant in focusing so much on reason to emerge from self-imposed immaturity. I think that we have to get a new relationship to ourselves, to other beings, to nature, and to everything that is transcending our world. If you believe in something that is above all that or under all that. And I think if we don't get a new vision of how the human being as part of the nature works and deals with itself, being in resonance with him or herself, with others, with things, with nature, then enlightenment will never come, because then we will always be detached from ourselves. And I think that is one of the worst sources that are fostered by the internet, by some uses of social media. They bring wonderful things as well, but they have also their problems. So this is my view on what is at stake for the moment. And against this background, I wrote this little piece. So we are discussing a new enlightenment, obviously, amongst other reasons, because we are aware that what we learned from the old enlightenment, or at least what traditionally is understood as enlightened, is no longer fit for purpose to deal with the multiple or nested or interwoven crises that we are facing at an ever faster pace in a row. To solve these crises, there's often a call for science and technology, also for economics or for the economy, but mainly for science and technology. In the pandemic, for example, we often heard the claim, follow the science. Politicians were asked to implement rules which scientists recommended to flatten the curve of infections and to control the pandemic. But science alone turned out to be insufficient. First of all, a lot of different sciences have to work together to combine all the necessary insights from virology, epidemiology, and infectiology to sociology, political science, and behavioral psychology, not to forget ethics as an orienting discipline. Already the dialogue between sciences themselves was and is far from perfect. Even controversies within one science, look at the debate between virologists all around the world, were not dealt with adequately during the pandemic. Second, all sciences lead to nothing if politicians prefer to follow their voters or do care more about their image instead of effective crisis management or long-term benefits for all. Third, sciences and technologies stick in labs and offices when people behave in opposite ways. If you have enough vaccines, but people don't take them, they are useless. And last but not least, if science gives us a technology such as vaccines at unprecedented speed, but politicians, the roots of economies and governance frameworks don't guarantee to bring them to all people, there is still a lot to be done. And I was very happy to read in the newspaper yesterday that the G7 take care of this topic now in the coming meetings. Obviously, science alone or technology alone are not doing the job. They need to be part of a societal narrative, and they must themselves tell stories. Not stories to bring illusions or to derange people, but to convey meaning. Eventually, we need the people, and people need stories so that science and technology can contribute to make the world a better place. That's where dialogue comes in. Stories need talking to each other. They need dialogue. And there's this ethically essential function of storytelling that Hannah Arendt phrased with much apropos. She said, storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error to defining it. Yeah, so it's not the meaning of a pencil that you can write, okay, we can define that, but the meaning to our lives, to what society should do and can mean, and to have a feeling of meaning and sense in our lives is much more than we can put into words and phrase adequately, but we can tell stories about that because they reveal what is meant. So let's see what the stories about science and about technology are like, whether these stories are truly enlightened, and then reflect how public policy can play a role here. So the traditional story about science, my first point, roughly sounds like this. Science is the methodologically driven, systematic endeavor to find the truth about this world and everything in and around it. Science gives us facts that can be repeated and proven or falsified, and science is independent from power, dependencies, money, or other kind of values, at least in democracies. Science is mainly for elites. It is complicated and increasingly specializing so that the wider public can't actually understand it. However, to not lose the support of the public, science explains itself from time to time and calls this science communication. Especially regarding health and life, science has brought us major developments. Diseases can be diagnosed, healed, at least treated, sometimes prevented, and life expectancy increased enormously during the last decades. Interestingly, life as a topic of science is occupied by so-called natural sciences. This is reflected by the terminology life sciences, which means just biology and all its subdisciplines. But does that reveal meaning to our lives? Almost everything in this traditional story about science is wrong or misleading. Scientific methodologies and research questions are not neutral, but already built on a specific view of the world and the human being. They imply a prioritization of the kind of knowledge that is deemed important. For example, when trying to understand a mental disorder, you use imaging and molecular genetics if you think of it as a biological problem. Or you use a qualitative interview, other methods and observation, including close persons, if you think of psychological and social factors being decisive. Or you use a mixture if you think that human being is a unity of body, mind, and emotions. Currently, there is a major shift towards biological psychiatry. Quantitative research methods with huge data sets are far more appreciated and thus incentivized by third-party funding and by high-ranking journals who are mainly in the natural science area than qualitative methods with low numbers of participants. This leads to a dominance of research on drugs and a neglection of social and psychotherapeutic research and therapies. Looking at health altogether, the dominance of the biological or even molecular worldview leads to a neglect of socioeconomic determinants of health as well, although they have a much greater impact on health than medicine and healthcare systems altogether. So-called innovative health technologies are fascinating and get the attention of researchers and investors, but their overall impact on health in relation to the financial investment might be less efficient than investing, for instance, in education of children and good teachers, or in healthy food or good working and living conditions. Science also builds on values. It's not neutral. At the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies phrased it in its statement on values for the future, the role of ethics in European and global governance. Values, we phrased it, values are baked into everything. No narrative evolves, no decisions are taken, no advice is given, no technologies are developed without values shaping them, whether consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly. And that's why we are human beings, and human beings have to make their decisions. And even if you decide not to decide, that's a decision. So to let things just happen is a decision. And when humans make a decision, they have to take the responsibility for it. So actually values, so that what you deem important for your life is in everything. What's more, science is not independent from power, money, politics, or other external influences. Research questions are shaped according to the publishability in a high-ranking journal, to the likelihood of getting funding, to the research calls and funding interests of ministries, and to the opportunity to start a business or the like. However, how Sheila Jasanoff, the nestor of the science and technology studies, crisply puts it, the myth of science's institutional purity still retains such a powerful grip on the social imagination. Science gives us facts and truths? Well, only preliminary ones. Falsification of scientific findings is always a possibility, and questioning research results is the most noble attitude of a researcher. Furthermore, to understand this world and to tackle major of different kinds of insight must be brought together, interpreted, and contextualized. Regarding climate change and related health problems, biology and geography alone are not doing the job. One needs a lot of more disciplines such as cultural science, economics, and sociology, and of course, philosophy and ethics. And eventually, scientific knowledge is not only about facts, but also about speculations and assumptions. And they are not less worthy than facts. Again, they are necessarily intertwined. Unfortunately, this is not reflected in our language. People are used to distinguish between sciences and humanities, and all too often this is paralleled with sciences being serious because they deal with the hard facts, whereas humanities babble and deal with soft issues, meaning not so important ones. This leads to disregarding a lot of important sciences in a broad understanding, including humanities and their impact on understanding and managing crises. What brings me now to the story of technologies. So which stories do we tell us about technologies? Technologies are machines or other things, as well as intangible objects like software, that enable us to do something that without them couldn't be done, or at least not so effectively. Technologies are artifacts that, as means in the hands of humans, can be used to do good and bad things. A knife can be used to kill a spouse. A cyber knife can be used to heal a patient. Humans are great inventors of technologies, and humans have the control over technologies. Although, with technologies becoming smarter and more numerous, we talk of them as if they were humans. They are autonomous cars, as if they could autonomously argue for better becoming a grass cutter than being a car. Or we say that an AI decides about the correct diagnosis and treatment for a patient with lung cancer, as if an AI could engage in reasoning and weighing reasons and values and the importance of side effects, for example, for that individual person. More and better technologies, so the story, mainly stand for more innovation, more wealth, more efficiency, better science, more modernity, more competitiveness, more profit. At the same time, there's a story about technologies making people afraid. The rise of digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, and recently ChatGPT overcoming the whole educational system, render human hands more and more obsolete and take their jobs away. Singularity and the superintelligence taking over the world are no longer only a subject of science fiction. Cyborgs are already living amongst us, and there are visions, for instance, from the Japanese roboticist Hiroshi Ishiguro, who predicts that the human body will be substituted part by inorganic materials. This prevailing ambiguous story is mainly a story about what Barry Schwartz calls thing technology. Things can be controlled, destroyed, repaired, touched, etc. But starting from a broad understanding of technology at the use of human intelligence to create objects or processes that change the conditions of daily life, there's another kind of technology which Schwartz calls idea technology. Unlike things, ideas can suffuse, as he writes, through the culture and have profound effects on people before they are noticed. What is even more disturbing, they can have these profound effects even if they are false, because they can influence people's behavior as long as people believe them. Schwartz nicely summarizes, whereas theories of the universe don't change the course of planets, theories of human nature change human nature, and false theories can come true. How? First, by changing how people think about their own actions and following from that, changing their future actions. If I think that I got vaccinated against the coronavirus because I want to protect my health and the health of others, but people tell me convincingly that vaccination is just a governmental means to take my liberty, and I was not mindful enough to realize that, I will perhaps not get another vaccination in the future. Whether this interpretation is right or wrong doesn't count. It only counts what people believe. And better facts alone usually don't make or change a belief. Second, ideas can change how other people react to the actor, and again, following from that, change the actor's behavior, thus being kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a father believes that his wife is not strong enough to raise their children properly, the relationship between the family members will not foster good education and family cohesion. He will react on the interaction and the relation between the mother and the children in a different way. He will convey different emotions. He will use different words and act in a different way. And this will influence and eventually produce that the mother will not adequately educate the children. And third, institutional structures are shaped according to ideas, and they again shape what people do and think of themselves. If you fundamentally distrust students' independence and consider them lazy, you will design universities as extended schools that ultimately turn students into, at best, dependent thinkers. Having that in mind, we see that think technologies are always coming with idea technologies, with stories that try to make sense from them. I come to the last point, the role of public policies. So what are the reasons for misleading and insufficient stories and narratives about science and technology? There are a lot of starting points, some going back to even Greek philosophy, others focusing on religions or individualism coming from Enlightenment, liberalism, humanism, or psychological aspects such as inclinations and ambiguities of people regarding excitements and safety, strong emotions and calmness, tradition and novelty. Science and technology studies underline that the narrative identity of societies and the way technologies are used and developed have a mutual influence on each other. Again, Sheila Jasanoff and her colleagues talk about social imaginaries, which she defines as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. And here's the crucial point where public policies come in. They are, in a way, the readers and the co-writers of all the stories and imaginaries which convey the meaning to everything that happens. If policies are meant to be good frameworks for democratic societies so that they can flourish, it is not enough for those who shape them to understand scientific facts and to properly use thing technologies. People who shape those policies like laws, governance, funding programs, etc., must understand the stories people believe in and tell each other. Regardless of what they find adequate, they first must listen and understand the narratives and underlying drivers. The energy that is in there can be used to make policies successful and working nicely. It is exhausting and mainly fruitless to directly counteract this energy. If policies are meant to change something, we cannot just say that a story isn't true or try to erase it. We have to do more than to appeal to reason. We have to tell another story. Let me give you an example. If people love all their digital devices and don't care too much about sharing the data with tech giants, it will cost a lot of energy, money, and quarrel to make this sharing as complicated as possible or even prohibited. It would be much easier and beneficial to shape policies where people can do what they want, while at the same time mitigating the unwanted or harmful consequences. It could, for example, be ruled the data have to be shared by the tech companies so that others can develop business models as well. And the power to shape our individual and societal lives is not only with a few mighty CEOs who earn so much money with technologies and data from others that they're actually writing the stories of our lives. Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism. The new story could be that people can decide where their data go, what they want to be developed with them for fostering social welfare, and that they can rely on laws protecting them from fraud and exploitation and discrimination. Humanities can frame the relationship between individuals, their data, and societies. For this to become a reality, for writing, telling, and living good stories, public policies must be in an ongoing dialogue with sciences, technologies, and the public. All of them must be willing to listen and to understand the stories of the others. Then to question these stories, including the own ones, so that all can build new idea technologies together with all those involved. Eventually, there would be a new enlightenment. So let me come to the end. Which story about our futures do we want to tell? Which imaginaries do we find ethically desirable? How do we secure that we as humans are writing our stories as a collective endeavor? Let's add a multicultural endeavor. Some sciences and technologies, especially AI, have become so powerful and influential that they exert the power to define our futures without us noticing it. Do we want that power in the hands of few technology companies? The disturbing consequence if we answer no is that we must rethink the combination of unlimited freedom of science that has its undoubted value and the rules of a free market as part of a new enlightenment. For a challenge of this dimension, global institutions and governance frameworks must be adjusted and strengthened so that they can embrace all the different stories around the world, appreciating the colorful pluriverse of narratives of all people, of all of us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation. It included so many aspects of dialogues between science, technology, and public policies. And at the same time, I think you pointed out the essence of the problem at here. I should have introduced you to the audience. I am very, very sorry. You are Professor at the Center for Life Ethics at University of Bonn. May I ask, in what field did you get your degree? Firstly, yeah.
So first I studied medicine and I was a doctor, and then I started philosophy and changed to ethics.
Okay.
And first I focused on health issues, so medical ethics or bioethics in a broader sense. And now recently I changed to broaden the scope because this breaking down of ethics into so-called area ethics doesn't seem adequate for these for what we face. Yeah, we cannot say, well, this is the triage in the pandemic, for example, is not only a medical ethics issue, it's also an economic issue and a cultural issue and so on. So I was just, I was convinced that it is no longer adequate to only engage in an area ethics. And so at the Center for Life Ethics, we focus on the dynamics that our lives mainly shape, and that is the technologization, the economization, the ecologization and globalization of our individual and societal lives. And so we focus now on these topics.
Oh, your biohistory is also interesting, maybe to the student. It was really a stimulus history. Thank you for that. Thank you so much. And next, I would like to ask O Sensei to give a lecture.
Sure. Thank you. I just realized that my presentation will pale definitely in comparison to the previous two substantial, thought-provoking, and very, very wonderful talks given by Professor國Ven as well as Professor Woo Pen. So you may take my presentation as a kind of entertainment in order to get well prepared for the wonderful talk, which will be given by Professor Gabriel afterwards. So I really wrote this as a kind of spice in order to season the whole symposium. So it is not substantial at all, but I want to raise a concept or even just a word, which I called the taste, in order to make it colorful and appropriate for today's discussion. So philosophy, ethics, and enlightenment. These three concepts cannot but remind me of a famous lecture delivered by a famous or infamous American philosopher called Leo Strauss in 1941 in New York, actually in New York, in New School for Social Research in New York, which is very, very famous institute for all kinds of immigrants from Europe, whose title back then is German Nihilism. So it is about nihilism as a kind of thought. Addressing the audience in the United States, an exemplary state of liberal democracy back then, Strauss tries to analyze the spiritual philosophical roots of the phenomenon of German nihilism, which attracted a lot of what he calls delicate and intelligent young people, just as you, in Germany. So according to Strauss, these young nihilists, profoundly influenced by the works of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, Ernst Röntgen, among others, naturally detest two things. First, the Anglo-Saxon principles of modern civilization and its emphasis on individuality, equality, pacifism, and so on and so forth. And second, the political vista, which might be regarded as a radicalization as well as a natural result, a historical result of modern civilization, namely a universal depoliticized state of communism or socialism. So they really thought that communism was approaching. They hate liberalism as well as communism, while unable to positively formulate a third way. While its most vulgar expression in political terms was Nazism, Leo Strauss argues that German nihilism in itself has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or genocide. Instead, it represents an intellectual inclination for seriousness, gravity, finitude, and community. Those young nihilists believe that only serious, community-based confrontations or antagonisms can make human life worth living, while the values of modern life only degrade and corrupt humanity. Convinced that a depoliticized communism is approaching and that modern civilization has degenerated into the machine-like, mechanical, meaningless bourgeois life, those young people fight against pacifism and advocate antagonism as well as militarism, a dangerous gesture that makes them appear militarist. For Strauss, however, this inclination for violence should be understood as a historical unfolding of modern civilization per se, especially a result of the philosophy of Enlightenment in the 18th century as well as its aftermath, because those young nihilists share the idea that as antagonism precedes order and peace, to destroy the modern civilization is precisely to go back to its original potential state. They are, argues Strauss, mistakenly led into an imagination of ancient times that one finds in the works of, say, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as German Romanticism. Now, without self-realization, then, these Germanalists are indeed an unfilial son of modern civilization. In their confrontation with modernity and its philosophical supports, those young people have been implicitly constituted by elements of their enemy. For instance, the emancipation of feelings, the emphasis upon subjectivity and individuality, the separation of the private sphere from the public sphere, and so on and so forth. Even they are taking for granted the necessity of the approaching communist state from Strauss' viewpoint only manifests how deeply they are involved in modern civilization. Now, when talking about how Germanalism rejects the principles of civilization as such in favor of war and conquest, in favor of the warlike virtues, Strauss says, quote unquote, Germanalism is therefore akin to German militarism. This compels us to raise the question what militarism is. Militarism can be identified as the value expressed by the older Malki in these terms. Eternal peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful one. To believe that eternal peace is a dream is not militarism, but perhaps plain common sense. It is at any rate not bound up with a particular moral taste. But to believe that eternal peace is not a beautiful dream is tantamount to believing that war is something desirable in itself. And to believe that war is something desirable in itself betrays a cruel, inhuman disposition. Now, it goes without saying that being akin to German militarism at least implies that Germanalism is not German militarism pure and simple. However, eventually, now we don't have time to paraphrase Strauss' intricate analysis here, the two be almost the same, if only because while Germanalism rejects modern civilization in favor of seriousness, militarism prefers the unutilitarian virtue, i.e. courage, to so-called enlightened self-interests. That is why, perhaps, while aiming at destroying modern civilization and the modern world, Germanalists fail to positively suggest an alternative. But if in the last analysis, Germanalism boils down to militarism, we must ask ourselves what to do about this intellectual crisis or revolution. How can we imagine a new Enlightenment out of the disillusionment of the Enlightenment that Germanalism in 1930s and 1940s has already expressly thematized and attacked? Well, Strauss' answer in his lecture, as we know, seems to be very, very simple. Namely, let's go back to Asian classics. Let's read Plato. To the great tradition of Asian civilization, which fortunately, he says, has been restored without corruption or abuse in the English thought. Whether he was merely paying lip service to the audience in America against the background of the resistance of the British against Nazism is not our concern here. On the contrary, what makes his analysis still interesting and relevant today is, I think, a little word hinted in the sentence that I just quoted. Let me repeat this sentence. To believe that eternal peace is a dream is not militarism, but perhaps plain common sense. It is at any rate not bound up with a particular moral taste. Strauss implies that to believe eternal peace is not a beautiful dream, then is bound up with a particular moral taste. What Germanalists' inclination for antagonism, finitude, and community represents is not so much a thought, a way of thinking, and philosophical system as a very particular moral taste. As its unfilial son, the taste for war and militarism of those young people in 1930s and 1940s Germany proclaims the ironical result of the promise of peace and order, shared to a great extent by the Enlightenment philosophers. Now, we are already familiar with this story, which has been sufficiently unfolded and analyzed in Horkheimer and Adorno's dialect of enlightenment. Be that as it may, the word taste also appears in the title of Leo Strauss' first treatment of Xenophon, written in 1938, namely The Spirit of Sparta or The Taste of Xenophon. Again, we don't have time to delve into this text. Suffice it to say that Strauss' recovery or rehabilitation of what he called exotic writing in the late 1930s and early 1940s may have a lot to do with the cultivation of the taste of those young people against the historical background of the crisis of modernity, when defensive discourses of modern values and modern thoughts are commonly regarded as ideological, outmoded, or simply naive. A tone accustomed to spicy food is unable to taste delicate nuances, while young people in general are naturally in favor of spicy food. So what is taste? Now, according to the Marxian theorist Raymond Williams, the word taste comes from the Old French and Old Italian, whose meanings have to do with physical senses such as feel, handle, touch, and so on and so forth. In the 15th century, there are texts in which good taste is used in the sense of good understanding. From the 17th century onwards, taste is generally capitalized as a general quality or human faculty. As separated from active human sense, suggests Williams, taste and good taste have significantly become a matter of acquiring certain habits and rules passively. When mentioning moral taste, however, what Leo Strauss means to say, I think, is something similar to Aristotelian moral virtues shared by the so-called gentlemen with good education and good discipline. A characteristic of moral virtues is that while they are indispensable for maintaining the order of the community, as well as a good way of life of the individual, these moral virtues cannot be properly and theoretically articulated. Thus, susceptible to rhetorical criticism, moral virtues in Aristotle become a middle point between community, political community, or if you will, ethics on one hand, and theoretical formulations, that is philosophy on the other hand. So between philosophy and ethics, you have moral virtues, or I think you have taste. By the same token, taste in the 17th and 18th centuries was developed into a distinct faculty that, argues Giorgio Agamben, aims at the judgment on and enjoyment of the beautiful, that is, a missing sense that mediates and relates the intellectual and the sensible. Through an examination of Plato, Montesquieu, Diderot, and Kant, Agamben concludes that, quote, taste is an empty or excessive sense, situated at the very limit of knowledge and pleasure, from which derives its metaphorical designation as the most opaque sense, whose lack of access essentially defines the stature of both science understood as knowledge that is known, can be explained, and therefore can be learned and transmitted, both science and pleasure. Pleasure here understood as a position on which one cannot found any knowledge, end quote. Due to the mediating function of taste, then knowledge and pleasure are related to each other in an impossible or inarticulable way. On one hand, insofar as taste is concerned with one's physical senses, with bodily effects and affections, it involves one's intuitions, reactions, and feelings that can hardly find a theoretical expression. But on the other hand, insofar as it nonetheless defines the particular stature of human knowledge, taste always refers to or anticipates an explicit articulation of the aesthetic, the sensible, and the affective. As concerning habits and rules not sufficiently theorized in one's daily life, taste might be subject to or affected by a new enlightenment whose purpose is to reorient people, especially young people, towards a revaluation of what they commonly judge as natural, valuable, or desirable. We will have to cultivate taste, which, contrary to what Kant argues in the opening pages in his third critique, does not continue to proceed even if no investigations are made. This new enlightenment, I argue, will not aim at a society governed solely by reason, a point which also already emphasized by Professor Woopen in a very nice way. Rather, it will primarily aim at keeping public opinions from being radicalized or politically intensified, a general tendency in the present day which is giving rise to all kinds of regional as well as global conflicts, a tendency that we are all witnessing every day on Twitter, YouTube, and other social networking platforms. Okay, so much is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei. Thank you so much for this wonderful, very, very interesting presentation. Dr. Woopen, Christian, you said enlightenment does not necessarily come from reason. That's a very important remark. And Kant, of course, Kant is just a starting point. Of course, interesting, very important starting point, but just a starting point. And now, Sensei talked about taste. It's very interesting and very wonderful coincidence. So, and you mentioned to a very wonderful figure of storyteller. So nice, so attractive concept. So, thank you. Finally, Marx, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Bon, je vous donne la parole.
Well, given that I didn't hand in anything, my talk ends here. No, there really is a talk. So I will seize the opportunity to clarify some aspects of moral realism as I understand it, in light of the idea with which we started our symposium, namely moral facts not being grounded in the divine. So I will pick up on that theme without thereby in any interesting sense questioning the divine, right? I will argue that the issue of the divine and of morality are just entirely orthogonal. So that one could not accuse me of atheism in any way. I would accuse those who accused Wolf of atheism. But that would be a longer story to be delivered when I'm much older and I write my book about God to make sure that I, find a place in heaven. But, we'll get there in 20 years time or 30, let's see. Today, I will not talk about the divine. That's all I had to say about the divine for now, that I won't say much about it. And that's not even a negative theology, or is it? Comment ne pas parler would have been another topic. So now let's talk about moral facts from a particular type of perspective. And again, I will clarify or try to clarify some aspects of my view and elaborate on a dimension that I haven't been speaking about in Tokyo this week yet, with respect to that dimension of my account of the New Enlightenment. And as you will see, I'm also very much in line with not believing that moral facts are grounded in reason. And they are not grounded in the following three candidates, I will argue. They're not grounded in reason, they're not grounded in God, and they're not grounded in evolution either. So these are three typical ways of trying to ground morality, right? God, more traditional, then reason, slightly less traditional, and then evolution, a la Churchland, etc., more recently, right? I think all three are wrong. Moral facts are not thus grounded. If they're not grounded at all, as you will see, but they bear an interesting relationship to what Kant called the will. So if we accepted some of the terms of the Kantian game, then I think this bit is where he gets it right. So just the opening line of the groundwork of morals, and then he deviates from what he should have said. So the rest is flawed, but he has a good opening line. So as you will see, but let the games begin. So in general, I understand ethics as the scientific subdiscipline of philosophy, which is in the business of investigating the nature and scope of moral facts. In general, a fact is something that is true of something, or easier, a fact is a true answer to a meaningfully posed question. So here's a meaningfully posed question. What is, the square root of -1? Haha, I. Okay, not me, but, the imaginary unit. Or, what is 2 + 2? 4. Where am I? Tokyo. These are all facts because they are true answers to meaningfully posed questions. Now, that's a fact. And some people have wondered whether they are moral facts, to which the answer is, of course. Let me give you an example. My favorite example, slightly changed from beer to sake. So you have to, there's a child drowning in shallow water and you are very thirsty. Now you're not that thirsty, you just want sake in the story. The beer had to do with thirst. So you really want sake, very cold, ice cold sake. That's what you want, right? And the ice cold sake is waiting over there. If you save the child, the sake will be lukewarm, kind of disgusting. So that's your choice. What do you have to do, right? And if you're like, I don't know, the sake is like, I really don't like it, then you don't get a moral fact. The moral fact is that you have to save the child. And now the point about this example is that you have to save the child, regardless of who you are. All it takes is your capability of doing so, right? So if you sit in a broken wheelchair and you can't walk, then you do not have to save the child, right? So everybody who's capable of saving the child, that is to say, has to save that child, regardless of who she is and regardless of who the child is. I have to save Putin's child, even though it might be fun to see him suffer. I have to save that child. I even have to save Putin, right? I would understand if Zelensky prefers the sake. I would cheer for that, to be honest, but secretly, it would still be a moral mistake. Even Zelensky would have to save Putin from drowning, not in his military capacity, but from a moral point of view. Okay, so that's the moral fact. Regardless of who you are and regardless of who the child is, you got to save that child. That's the universalizability intuition, right? And here the idea is not that you need a demanding, as we will see, categorical imperative to make sense of this. All you need is the logical form of a moral fact. Yeah? Thou ought to phi, where phi is a proposition with a moral content. Okay, phi instead of p. What I mean by this is it's something that you ought to do, an action. Phi, it's just an action. And thou ought to phi, regardless of who thou arest. Okay, so that's the nature of a moral fact. Okay, so it's not the question of, how can I universalize this? Whoever is thou has to go in and save the child, and phi in this particular case is saving the child under such and such a condition, right? And you can build the context, which you should do, such as if you're not in a wheelchair, etc., right? You can build that into the action type. So of course there will be a lot of context for ethics, right? You have to save the child if and only if you see the child, it is a child, it's close, right? I don't have the child to save the child which is now drowning somewhere in China, not because I want that child to drown, but I can't go there now, right? So that fact is not. So again, you build the context into the proposition. So someone might say, what about the context? The reply to this is, well, then just build it into the proposition, and then you get the unconditional. So what you have to do, the positive moral fact, is the deontologically necessary, as the saying goes. So it's unconditionally valid. So you absolutely, under all circumstances, given those circumstances, under all circumstances, you have to save the child. That's a moral fact. So thereby we have demonstrated that there are moral facts, case closed, right? And now no argument of any of the form, what about cultures, right, could relevantly play a role there, because again, the context is all built in. You can't say, well, if you're a Russian, you don't have to save the child for some cultural reason. Or if you are a Maoist, you don't have to save the child for some cultural reason, right? That's a completely nonsensical proposal. So someone like Nietzsche, right, doesn't find a play, you know, he can't even get in, right? If Nietzsche now wants to say, what about the genealogy of morals? I can say, yeah, well, what about it, right? And then he would say something like, well, read that book. And I say, yeah, I did. So what about it? And I don't think Nietzsche has anything to say about this. There's no maneuver where you can say, what about the genealogy? Well, the genealogy of what? There's no genealogy, right? What about the genealogy of mathematics? Well, 2 + 2 is 4. So what about it? You see, so I'm not even saying that there's like a deep challenge, genealogical challenge. There's no challenge, right? It's an empty maneuver. It's like a dance, and then Nietzsche dances, as he says, he tends to dance, and then he dances, and I'm like, okay, thanks for the dance, but again, this is the moral fact. Okay, so you can't get in with this kind of argument against, in favor of something like relativism or whatever that exactly would be. Yeah? So moral realism, I think, for these cases is entirely obvious, and all you need is a sufficiently neutral concept of a fact. So what makes people nervous, including Nietzsche, is German nihilism. That is the idea that moral facts, or facts even in general, are somehow suspicious due to something about us, right? How could we know them, etc. So I'll get to that dimension. And in particular, there's the strong idea that they are, to use Mackey's now politically incorrect term, they are queer, right? John L. Mackey, in his famous book, Inventing Right and Wrong, objected to moral facts that they are queer. Due to progress in political language, we can now say, you can't speak this way, Mackey, so Mackey is fortunately out of the game, right? But what he meant by this is, of course, they don't fit into a scientific conception of reality. But here I can draw on Christiane's, I think, very useful remark that such a way of understanding science is a political narrative. And given that there are different political narratives, none of this is in any relevant way grounded, as it were, in science, to rule moral facts out because of physics, right? Again, this is like the Nietzsche case. Someone can say this, but it doesn't really cut any eyes. When you say that's a moral fact, you ought to save the child, then nobody can say, what about physics? And then again, I say, well, what about it? Right? So again, that's not even a maneuver. So I'm not terribly impressed by naturalism. And why would I be, right? Just like I'm not impressed by genealogy at this level, right? Again, doesn't cut any eyes. Now, that's the idea. And let's come to what I promised, the question of grounding, right? So what are moral facts grounded in? And I haven't, given you the full analysis that I think is apt, because it involves the human being, and then grounding issues will make their appearance also in the account that I'm offering. So a fact is, so here's something that I think Kant really did very effectively, and for this I praise him. He asked the following very good question, which I think is the foundational question of meta-ethics, or ethics for short, in a certain sense. Namely, we have reasons for action, right? Here, reasons doesn't mean reason. If you ask me, why, did you buy the jasmine tea? I can give you some story. Sooner or later, some psychoanalysis or something would come in, but I can give you like a story like, oh, I wanted the jasmine, I liked the green, and I felt like jasmine, etc., etc. And, I'm always drink it when I'm here. And I give you a reason why. And also I'm thirsty, and the green tea didn't appeal to me. That's a reason for action, right? And why did I use that example where I just saw that? I could have used the coffee, etc. Reason for action. These reasons for action are not morally relevant. Nobody would say, how could you buy the jasmine tea, in the tone of voice in which you say, how did you not save the child? You see, there's no ethical tone of voice when you say, how did you buy the jasmine tea? Unless you're an ecological extremist and you say something like, it's made out of plastic. How could you buy the jasmine tea, right? Okay. So, or that the company producing the jasmine tea is involved in child labor in North Korea, then you could say, how could you buy the jasmine tea? Okay, but let's imagine the company and the plastic are like kind of okay. right? It's biodegradable, futuristic Tokyo plastic, and they actually reduced child labor in North Korea, right? By sending weapons to families or something, right? And that's like, yeah, cool. So then would be morally relevant, but let's just assume it's an ordinary, But apart from this case, what I'm saying is many reasons for action have nothing to do with ethics. Most things that we do, I realized how important this is when I forgot which reasons for action guy, Joseph Raz it was, when Joseph Raz gave a talk at NYU and he had the usual reasons for action. We have reasons for action, and action is something you do for a reason, analytic philosophy analysis. And then Paul Boghossian raised the wonderful question. He said, well, there are lots of things I do just so, like, looking out of the window. What's the reason for action? So there are things we do just so. Then there are things, and I think there are also actions. Then there are things we do for a reason. There are actions, but not all of those reasons are moral reasons. And I think Kant tried to answer the question, which of the reasons for action are moral reasons? That's, I think, the question of the second critique. And his answer is those that are subject to the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is in that particular sense a principle of ethics and not a general rule such that every morally relevant action is either morally recommended or morally prohibited because it somehow falls under the principle. So I don't think that Kant has anything to say of the form, should I take that vaccine? Well, let's consult the categorical imperative, right? I don't think that, and if that's Kant's proposal, then he miserably failed, right? Because you don't get very far. But I don't think that this is what's going on. I think Kant is responding to this problem, nicely formulated later by the recently deceased Ernst Tugendhat as the problem of ethics. So now my response to which of our reasons for action are the morally relevant ones is the following. The reasons for doing or not doing something that you have simply in virtue of our shared humanity. So if there's something that I owe to all of you right now under the given circumstances, simply because we're all humans, then that is a moral reason. That's the picture that I'm proposing. So in virtue of our shared humanity, there's something that we owe to each other, to use the Thomas Scanlon formula. And like Scanlon in the famous book, who says that ethics might be more limited than we thought earlier, at least on that understanding. There are different legitimate uses of the term ethics. Yeah? So if Christiane would correct me in a certain way in a longer debate about what we understand by ethics, though this is very close, right? Then I could say you have a broader notion and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm focusing on that, right? This is just a specific focus. Yeah? Like I'm doing quantum theory, so I'm looking at fermions, right? And someone else is doing astrophysics and they're looking at galaxies, and that's not a mistake either, right? It's just I'm looking at the ethical at a particular scale, and with my knife, my cut. So let's continue cutting, right? And cyber knife, hopefully, and not the wife to kill my spouse from the example earlier. So next cut then, right, is, yeah, what about that humanity? So if there's something that we owe to each other in virtue of our shared humanity, I call that humanism, that idea. Then the question becomes, what is it about our humanity such that we are those beings, right? Those living processes for which the ethical is open. What is it about us? And now my story about the will, and then we come to grounding and not grounding in anything. So Kant famously says about the will that it's a particular type of self-determination, namely acting, as he says, according, that's one translation, according to, a particular form of our maxims. But he says more precisely, according to a representation of them. So he says literally, will is the capacity to act according to the representation of law. Nach der Vorstellung von Gesetzen. Handeln. That's the definition. Nach der Vorstellung, according to a representation of the law. And I will now give you my interpretation of it. what that means. Maybe Kant did not quite intend the following, but I think he's, at least on the way to it. So humans do, that's my interpretation of the Barry Schwartz point that is so dear to you. Humans do what they do in light of a conception of themselves. So if you think of yourself as an animal in a universe, right, and of sharing animality with other living things in the universe, snakes and giraffes, multicellular organisms and bees and so forth, right? You think, I share something with them, that's animality. It sets us apart from the plants, it sets us apart from the stones, and we are on some planet which came into existence in such and such a way and is flying around, super rapidly, but you don't quite notice, and then something with Einstein to explain this. If this is your worldview, right, then you act in accordance with that worldview. For instance, then you think, how was life before I was born? Not at all. I wasn't there. How will life be when I'm dead? Exactly like before. Not at all for me, right? That's German nihilism or modern nihilism. And it's not obvious that this is true. I want to emphasize that. The question of the immortality of the soul or reincarnation or whatever is wide open. It's not like we suddenly found out, right? It's around 1900, the humans sat down and, consulted physics, and it's like, oh, the immortality stuff is refuted. Did you hear that? And then someone will say, hey, immortality is out, right? It's like, okay, too bad. Then life after death will be exactly like life before death, not at all. And meanwhile, let's enjoy and ask the economists to help us set up a good society, right? Positivism of the 19th century style, which got incredibly influential and still is, right? But that's just one conception of human being or human becoming, right? As the saying goes here. And here, there are other ones, right? And which one you have, if you're Hindu, or the Pope thinks and better things that he has an immortal soul, right? So if the Pope thinks he has an immortal soul, then the Pope thinks that story can't be true, right? So he has to think something that, at the beginning of time, God created my essence, then it got materialized in that universe, and it will go on after it got materialized here, right? And that's what he should think. And the Hindu will think, well, before that incarnation, so I'm lucky, I'm a philosopher, so I should become a Hindu because then I'm close to salvation. In the last round, I might have been a business person, and then I had to be reborn to suffer from my business past, and now I'm a philosopher, and so I can reach salvation, and there's no further round for me, last round, okay? So that would be the Hindu belief, right? Or I become a Buddhist, and then I realize I don't have a self, so I'm gone already. So that's a salvation easier, right? I can get it now. I don't have to wait until death. I get salvation now, right? And whatever it is, I'm not saying which one of those is true. It's the immortal soul. No, not kidding. No, I don't know which one's true. All of those are conceptions of the human being. Here's another one, Dan Dennett or whatever, and Dawkins, they sit down together and they're like, oh, we're just neural firing patterns designed to spread their genes, right? That's it. I got to have children with as many people as possible and spread my genes so that my neural firing pattern continues. And maybe I can even upload it on a computer and then I have digital children as well. Isn't that great? Right? So that's another worldview or view of the human being. And the important point about this, you get the idea, is that what Kant calls the will, in my interpretation, is the capacity for self-determination. And that capacity for self-determination is what is addressed by the moral facts. The moral facts address that in you. I call this with a very German word, Geist, which is translatable into, unproblematically translatable into Japanese, I think, right? Spirit is not quite adequate in English, right? But I think you have the exact same meaning for Geist in, I know it is in Chinese. What is Geist in phenomenology of spirit? What's the Japanese word? Seishin, yeah, so that's Geist then. Yeah? I'm saying Seishin is what moral facts are addressed to, right? That we are spiritual living beings. That's my conception of us as humans, spiritual living beings. And so now, regardless of whether Geist is an immortal soul or not, that's an additional question. it is real. And that's what moral facts are addressed to. It's the capacity for self-determination, and to use the Barry Schwartz idea, depending on how you conceive of yourself, right, you become that in an interesting way. So imagine I do have an immortal soul, but then Dawkins convinces me that this is a delusion, right? But I do really have one. So now I believe that my actually having an immortal soul, right, is a delusion, but that's then the delusion. So I become a deluded immortal soul, which believes of itself that it's mortal. So I changed my status. My earlier example is of me becoming someone who believes that he's a good tango dancer. So imagine somehow I think that, oh, I'm a born tango dancer, right? Gabriel sounds like Buenos Aires. So I go to Buenos Aires. I can hardly walk, let alone dance. So you see me dancing, when people are like, this is embarrassing. My wife tells me, you got to stop doing that. But I think, no, I'm just better at it, right? And then I stay there. My wife leaves me and I become a miserable person in Argentina. If this happened, then you see, the mistake about myself changes my status. I'm now a deluded tango dancer, but I have become different. I have changed myself. That's freedom or will, freedom of the will. And now that is what I believe the moral facts are addressed to. That's why it's in virtue of our shared humanity that we, right, owe something to each other. We owe something to that capacity, right, of self-conception. That's why we owe each other respect for that capacity. So regardless of how you conceive of yourself, I owe you respect. So if you have beliefs about yourself as Japanese in a particular way, if you think about your subjectivity as Japanese, then I owe you for that respect, not because you are Japanese, but because you have a Japanese self-determination, whatever that means in great detail. And then the humanities go into what does this even mean, right? So that's the picture. That is what's addressed in us. And these moral facts, right, are not grounded in anything beyond them. We don't need that. And I will conclude with that consideration then. They are not grounded in God because of Euthyphro's contrast, the famous argument, do the moral facts obtain because God declared them to obtain, or does God declare them to obtain because they obtain? So imagine you're an omniscient being, whatever kind of divinity, and now you look at torture and you're like, should I make torture good or bad? Okay, torture should be bad. And then you look at, drowning the child, bad. But you could also have said good, right? God is drowning the child. Well, let's make that good, right? So that's the Cartesian idea of God's modal power. And I think that's just wrong. When God looks at torture, he says bad, because bad torture is bad. God is omniscient. And God's omnipotence does not mean if they exist, okay? It's just a thought experiment. So that means that the good, right, is not grounded in God. That's a meaningless idea. God might radiate the good, right? He might be a good propagandist of the good, right? But he doesn't ground it. So it can't be grounded in God. That does not mean that God does not exist or that God is irrelevant for morality, but it's not grounded in the divine of any form. That's number one out. Reason can't be the case because the will is not reasonable. It has something to do with reasons for action, but it's not a priori thinking of the way Kant thought. It's about the human life form, and therefore does not as such necessarily apply to everything that counts as reasonable. Kant is thinking of aliens in particular. So that's ruled out as well. If they're aliens with ethics, I would say we should think of them as humans. However they look. So imagine they come down and they're like pink, slimy pyramids, right? Then we'd say, oh, humans, they just look different, right? We would include them into our diversity. So they just look different, right? And then they talk to us and I don't know, Hebrew, and we would say, yeah, just humans. They just look different. That would be my response to the alien problem, right? Because the human shape is not constitutive of our access to morality. And lastly, evolution. That has become a fashionable idea to say humans are pro-social mammals. They help each other, right? Therefore, morality is grounded in evolution. So higher level morality is then at the end of the day just a complicated late modern version of an ape helping an ape to survive against the lion, right? And so at the end of the day, it's kind of, the genetic family, helping each other out and then extending this to other species because we can afford it. That's the Churchillian view these days. And other people, right, Dawkins and so forth, they think there's something evolutionarily useful about morality. And while I think there is something useful about morality for humans, it is because it addresses humanity and not human animality. So I think the evolutionary grounding can also be ruled out. So morality is neither grounded in the divine, nor is it grounded in reason, nor is it grounded in evolution. That's the new Enlightenment. Having said that, we need to give a full picture of the human being in order to find the place of will in our life form. And from the perspective that I'm propounding, I would more than, as always, happily accommodate Christiana's proposal, which I think is a wonderful case for saying exactly that. You got to look in a relaxed way at the policy world and those narrative, and then we can think of your concept of a narrative precisely in light of a way of specifying human self-determination, rather than as us buying one of those stories, just accepting scientism or immortalism. Yeah, and I think a good ethical point of view remains second order, neutral with respect to those first order self-determinations, while taking their reality seriously as the ground of ethics. So if ethics is grounded at all, it's grounded in the will, but the will is its own ground. So there is this structure of self-grounding involved. So morality is not grounded in something not moral. That would not go, right? That's the good old Morean argument. You cannot replace the good in ethical propositions with something that's not the good, such as useful for animals or good in the eyes of God, right? These analyses all don't work. The good is, after all, the good. And I conclude with that. And I'm looking forward to further discussions, but I wanted to seize that opportunity to bring out this, the relationship to religion that plays a role in the new Enlightenment. It's not in opposition to any of the religions. That's precisely not where the action is. So it's more accommodating. It's in no interesting way Eurocentric, right? I happen to have a European passport. That's as Eurocentric as my new Enlightenment is. It's been inspired by engagement with Japanese philosophers first, right? So I'm in the Wolf scenario. My Chinese philosopher is the Japanese philosopher Takahiro Nakajima, who is a Chinese specialist. So, like I'm kosher in Asia. And so like those objections don't apply. I'm not an imperialist. I hope I'm not a racist. I try my best. I'm not a misogynist, etc., etc. And if I am, please correct me and help me to overcome those evils. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Your concept of moral facts always forces me to think so many things. And today you connected this concept of moral facts to the new Enlightenment, and it's very inspiring and very, very interesting and very, very powerful, as you always are. And now coming to the discussion time, and so you can freely, of course, comment each one of us. But maybe Christian, you used a very interesting, wonderful expression, narrative identity of society, right? Maybe from the viewpoint of narrative identity of society, you can maybe comment something about his concept of moral facts. Maybe because according to Marx, values, of course, is not grounded nor in reason, nor in God, nor in evolution, but maybe there, right? Values are there, but it comes from the reality, if I may say. But Christian, you stressed the important role of narrative identity of society. It's a very, I don't know if I understand you well. Maybe you can comment something.
I think so, but I would be following up on what Marcus said, and I am quite glad that we all convene in the issue on how to deal with reasons and the will, and that the human being is more than only the will or only reasons. But I think there are some interesting tensions not contradictions between an approach coming from narratives and then dealing with moral facts. Because the fact implies that you can come there by analysis, and the narrative starts from living. Yeah, and that's a completely different starting point. That doesn't mean and imply that it has to end up in different consequences and conclusions, but that's to try out. And for example, I would say the example of rescuing the child seems obvious for me, and I think that's all. But if you have the narrative, or if you have a meaningfully posed question like how to deal with a child that is born with severe impairment, do you have to save this child, this newborn as well? And there are different answers out there. If you talk to Peter Singer, you get another answer as if you talk to some deontologist, or if you talk to indigenous people, who just give this child just set it out in the forest and say it was not meant to live. They love it, and they have a very appreciative attitude to this child, but nevertheless, they don't save it. And what I also would ask is, what do we owe to animals? So if moral facts come what we owe to each other as a shared humanity, what does that mean for dealing with animals? So from my narrative, I would say that is a part of nature. They have, as living beings, a worth in themselves, though it might be a different worth as we talk about human dignity, for example. But I don't yet see, and I'm looking forward to listen to your answer, what the shared humanity means regarding moral facts about what we owe to animals. And the last question, so narratives have the implication that they deal on different levels. They have a lot of levels and in between levels. Yeah, moral facts seem to be quite clear. And I wonder on which level these moral facts are. So take human rights as an ethical approach, for example. Then you have the possibility to say, well, all people in the world agree that self-determination, let's stick with that, has to be respected. Just because this is a human being that is self-determined, and self-determination has to respect it. But self-determination can mean completely different things in concrete situations. So if you say a self-determined patient to stay in the health sector, in the European or Western approach, we have a very individualistic understanding and say this person has to say about him or herself what he or she wants to have done with her body, with therapies and so on. And in Western traditions, at least, I don't know yet how Japan is thinking mainly about this issue of end-of-life decisions and how long life has to be prolonged and how long do you want to stay in intensive care units, although there's no much prospect of, not a very good prognosis to survive this. If you talk to people in Turkey, they want to live as long as possible, even if it is in an unconscious state in an intensive care unit. So respecting self-determination doesn't tell me anything about how to deal with that person, apart from talking to him or her, to their family. And self-determination, by the way, in other cultures than the Western ones, also means building their decisions in a family environment and not by themselves as an individual. Self-determination is more contextualized in other cultures. Yeah, so I wonder how far moral facts lead us in when facing these very diverse living conditions and contexts and so on. I can agree on starting with a moral fact like respecting self-autonomy. So the moral facts then mainly are accepting a certain set of human rights, but what they mean in a concrete situation I wonder how far this can bring us then, how far the orienting function can be and how eindeutig, also how unambiguous they can be.
Thank you, Christian. Wonderful comment. And now I ask you, Marcus, to prepare your answer. And because I'm so sorry, I have to ask Hajitani Sensei to give a closing remark because he has to leave now for a lecture, so for his seminar. So now he gives a closing remarks, and you answer the comment. And during his closing remarks, you prepare the comment.
Yeah, I'm very sorry for interrupting your discussion. It's not closing remark, but just my personal or as a representative of UTCP. And thank you very much for your wonderful lectures and little discussion so far. And I must, as Koichiro said, I must leave for my class. But I was very looking forward to this symposium. And I think this relationship between our university and Marcus is based on probably the personal relationship between Professor Nakajima and you. And I am very glad that it developed so far to this symposium. And I think this is not a coincidence, I think, because let me talk about a little history of UTCP. This center, University of Tokyo Center for Philosophy, is in Japanese, literally translated International Philosophy Center for Coexistence. So here, coexistence means any kind of coexistence, like human nature, human technology, and among ethnicity or gender, or people with the disability or illness or any kind of coexistence was our topic of the center. And we have been thinking about this problem and searching for such a coexistence. I think, therefore, today's topic, New Enlightenment, was what we have been long thinking of. I am a relatively new member of UTCP, and Professor Nakajima is one of the founder of the UTCP, and Professor Kokubun is, so to speak, graduated from the center. So we are members of the UTCP, and in that sense, we are not connected with just the academic relation level, but also the such actual interests and, so to speak, existential relationship. So I hope that because I must leave now, I must discuss with you again, not again, but later. For that purpose, and not only for that purpose, I hope that our relationship develops from now, not only on the personal level, but also the institutional level among centers or programs of EAA for the future, not only for our generation, but also for the younger generation, like students here. And I hope that somehow we can have a young generation involved somehow in the exchange between also German students and Japanese students from now. So I hope that we meet each other again. And I'm very, very sorry that I interrupted this discussion. I leave now for my class. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. ラジャニ先生、ありがとうございました。Thank you so much. Sorry, I really wanted to give him the floor. So now maybe Marcus, you can answer to your colleague.
Fortunately, you bought me some extra minutes. So let me answer to the animals and then to like a particular charge of the universalism problem, right? So, let's call this, like polemical against myself, a Kantian hangover that Christiane is pointing to. Like there's a version of a problem there, but you know, you formulated it more specifically. I'll get to that. So as it were, the conceptual, you know, how do our conceptions of ethics, right? What is it when they meet, right? So how do we position your approach to ethics, which is, you know, intentionally, as you always point out, a very broad one which neither is, you know, broken down into areas, right? Nor necessarily, you know, inclines towards, you know, the safe meta-ethical haven, as it were, right? So, and I don't want to call it applied, because that's also a misbegotten category. In the way in which you think about ethics, just ethics. I don't think an extra word for this would be needed, right? Life ethics might do it. It specifies some of its dimensions. So I'll get to that in the second part, responding to the conceptual territory. And first on the animals. Well, there I would say I have a very long story about animals. I think the concept of an animal is empty, but you know, nevertheless, I get to, you know, I just replace this by living beings, and then we're fine, right? So, you know, I don't need the long story. We are still back at, you know, what do we do with snakes, et cetera, right? And elephants and so forth. So that doesn't go away just because I have a complicated relationship to the concept of an animal, right? What we roughly mean is still there, right? So, and I always say, if a lion baby drowns and it's the sake, I still have to save the lion baby. So we owe something to each other, but we owe to each other that we owe something to non-human nature. So I think that's included in the moral facts, but not because these other systems are ends in themselves in the way in which we are, right? So I owe something to the lion, regardless of the absence of a will. In the concept of will that I use, the Kantian or spirit, I don't think they got that, right? Or maybe they have glimpses of this or something similar, but that's not bad news, right? That's not insulting the lion. That's also saying what the lion is responsible for and what not. So the lion does not have to save my child if she's drowning. He can drink the sake and doesn't make a moral mistake. He will drink the water, I assume, right? Where there's the baby's drowning, drinks the water. Like that's what you see in Africa, literally, right? Some other animals drowning and they just drink the water where someone's drowning. We would say that's inhumane, right? And it is. They're not humans. So I don't think that they have access to moral facts. But part of the moral facts, I would say, is that we owe something to them, right? So I'm very happy with animal ethics. Also, if the term of animal makes sense, then we are animals. So any ethics is animal ethics because we are animals, right? So animal ethics, to some extent, has to always come as a free lunch, unless you're really a Kantian. Then it's getting really tricky, and other ethicists also have problems with that, right? So there's a sense in which this is slightly easier to answer than the second question, I think, right? So that would just say, you know, they're in the moral facts, the animal ethics and the environmental ethics facts. I would build them in as a response. The second one, of course, is a little bit harder. So, and because it's about not only the heuristics, I would say, of moral facts, but about the moral facts themselves. So if I stick to my analytic approach, which I will do, but then I will also try to show where our views do not fully overlap, right? To the extent to which I can stick to my model, I would say, take the Turkey self-determination case versus the German self-determination case at the end of life. There I would say, you know, either the one group or the other group or a third group gets it right. So I would definitely say one of us gets it wrong, right? Yeah. But it is part, given that we don't know who that is, I don't know, right? And given that all the experts who are really thinking and working about this in the field, really thinking this through, none of them would make a straightforward knowledge claim, right? So I would go to you, Christiane. You have worked in these very important, like serious ethics council things concerning very difficult moral situations. Do we know what to do? You would say, no, we don't know. You would say exactly what you say. So I take that as important evidence, right? And say, okay, we humans don't know, right? But I would nevertheless say there is something to know. We just haven't found it. But there's a second order moral fact, I think, namely treating this self-determination in what we call other cultures, however we individuate a culture, that gets tricky, but what we describe is something which we need to treat with respect. So given that we don't know, if people in Turkey, for whatever reason, want to stay as long as they want, and the Germans want to go as soon as they can, say, or the Californians, right? The Californians want to go, I'm sick, oh, I'm out, right? I can't be sick, so they go earlier. Then I would say in this case, we got to respect that and see how to negotiate on, dynamic territory, right? That's a type of ethics in action, life ethics maybe, right? A particular type of negotiation, which is itself, controlled, oriented, you would say, right, by an ethical stance of respect for the self-determination. And I would read that as self-determination under conditions of not knowing. We just don't know for many hard facts. But I would say, in principle, we could. So here's where the analytic stance enters. I would say, we don't try hard enough, right? So like late Derek Parfit once said, secular ethics, meaning something like scientific ethics in my sense, secular out, because it's not about secular, has just started. Sometimes I think of the critique of practical reason as the level of the physics of Kepler, right? So Kant was like, some things are falling and some are falling fast, and then he wrote this down. It's very primitive physics, not even Newtonian. And so the scientific ethics that I have in mind, right, has not even reached Newtonian state, but I am hoping for an algebra of normativity. So my role model is the now largely forgotten Leonard Nelson. He was an ethicist in Göttingen at the time when all the big physicists were there. He was, and mathematicians, he was part of that group. And he wrote a nice book on moral realism. And he also said, we need to turn this into a serious science, something along those lines, right? So that's at least what I'm engaged in. And now closing, I would say, we could think of our use of the term ethics and then your practice of it and my practice of it, right, as two models of ethics. And then sticking with your narrative language, we can say, like my analyticity is a particular style of storytelling which gets us certain things, right? And your narrative telling, right, gets us other things. And I think that would be a fair approach to the ethical realm due to the fact that it's too important to recognize that there are many things we don't know in that realm. This is how I would do it. Because there the knowledge or its absence matter more than in any other area. Because it concerns the human life form as such, right? So I'm happy to go into into a careful negotiation rather than think of my model of that space as absolute. I think in the corner that I cut out, I get it right, but I'm fully aware that I'm cutting out a corner from ethics. And the question is how things look around the edges, right? And I think you take a broader view of the landscape. And your take on ethics comes from this broader understanding.
Thank you, Marcus. Do you have a question? No questions? Okay. So, thank you. Today I'm so glad to have such a big audience. Thank you for coming. Thank you. All they are students. So maybe this is time for you to ask questions. So any questions? Oh, okay. じゃあちょっと誰か。
Hi, thank you for your very interesting lectures. So I have a question about Marx's view on moral facts. So as you mentioned, moral facts are grounded on humanity. And my question is humanity is a kind of fundamental part of our reality. So the concern I have is humanity is not a fundamental. So there might be something which grounds humanity. So you ruled out the three possibilities. So God grounds moral facts, and reason grounds moral facts, and evolution grounds moral facts. But so among these possibilities, I think evolution might be grounds humanity in some way. So if so, so moral facts might be grounded by evolution in some way. So this might be a good naturalistic approach, I think. So I think so. So what is the place of humanity in your overall picture of reality? I think.
Fine question.
That's a great question. So, first I will help myself to the usual tools of ontological pluralism, right? That's just in my toolbox. And I would say specifically on this question, even if there's a sense in which parts of humans are grounded in something that's not human, such as cells or fermions and bosons, right? We can think of our bodies as grounded in this particular way, right? Quite a bit of the shape of our bodies can be best explained in virtue of ignoring the dimension of humanity that are brought in. But any such description of the human being will just say that a part of the human being is grounded in something, but not the humanity, right? You cannot reduce or replace in any other language the bit about spirit by something that does not have its shape. Spirit is indispensable. It's the position from which you characterize both yourself and everything else. And once you try to replace that position, I call it spirit, you can call it whatever, life, subjectivity, many names have been proposed for that, right? First person point of view, etc. Maybe the moral laden point of view, whatever that is, if you try to ground this in something via naturalism, then you don't even have it inside, right? So this, to use not my favorite language, but it might be useful, this sideways on point of view between the relation concerning the relationship of the mental and the non-mental, right, doesn't get off the ground unless you have a concept of the mental. And having a concept of the mental is having a concept of the mental as fundamental. Yeah. So you can't sidestep it, right? Because if you do, you lose. Then you don't get the phenomenon in view at all. That's the problem. Yeah. Just a very simple demonstration of the gist of that argument, right? So imagine that you hold the following view: all mental states are correlated with neuronal states. I think not even that is true, but imagine you believe that, right? So, something's mental. So whenever there's a psi, there's some phi, right? Imagine you hold the view. Then you have therefore, of course, in no way demonstrated that the mental can be reduced to the neuronal. All you have said is they correlate. So you are a dualist. So now you can say, okay, let's ground the one and the other. You're still a dualist, right? Well, then let's reduce one to the other. You're still a dualist because you still think about the mental. So the only way not to think about the mental is to deny its existence, right? Then it. You got to say that doesn't really exist. It's just a manner of speaking. That's what you can say. But now you lost the mental out of you, right? You're not even talking about it anymore. So it's a position that you cannot in any meaningful way eliminate, reduce, etc., etc. And I've argued that case today. I tried to argue that case for the moral, because I think that a specific form of mind, namely the human mind, which in that respect, in my view, differs from the mind of other living beings significantly. It's what sets us apart from them. We do physics, they don't. We do ethics, they don't. We have mega cities, they don't, right? And etc., etc. All of this is an expression of what I call mind, right? That and the good are connected. Spirit is the good, right? To say it's a little bit old school.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We have some. Okay.
Thank you for your wonderful talks. My question is mainly to Professor Wang and perhaps also to Professor Woopen. It seems to me quite interesting, or perhaps maybe parapractic, perhaps deliberate, that Leo Strauss mentioned the words common sense in the same sentence as taste, because I think there's no such thing as taste that isn't in common or held in a commonness, let's say. And this is, of course, its danger, because when taste is held in common, then if the common goes mad, then so does taste, right? And I think that's why people have always tried, or there's always a tendency within thinking, but also really in politics as well. For example, just look at the technocracies where people try to cling to reason because we think that reason, one, cannot go wrong, and two, because reason, it seems to be a sort of short circuit between the self and the universality, or in your language, perhaps England and Russia. And that's why one sort of wants to cling to reason in favor of something like taste. So I guess in such circumstances where taste can go wrong in a sort of common sense, let's say, could you maybe elaborate or give an argument that says that actually, even when taste can go wrong, it is precisely that we have to cultivate and cling to, and not reason. And I don't know what I guess I'm just interested in what kind of an argument one can give in favor of taste over reason. And perhaps this might also be a question to Professor Woopen as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I can actually, I think you answer your question yourself. And so I will just repeat what you have said. And by one sentence, I can answer your question, as well as maybe make a very boring just not a question, but like personal impression concerning Professor Gabriel. Very strong argument about moral realism. So actually, taste is a keyword of Kant's third critique, in which you have on each and every page the phrase judgment of taste. And the judgment of taste, of course, is directly related to Kant's understanding of common sense. So it is, these two are directly related to each other. So in order to understand what we share with each other and why my judgment concerning, let's say, this bottle of water to be beautiful, and I always want to make it a universal judgment. It is not my personal preference. I judge it to be beautiful in the sense in which I think others will agree with me. So I presuppose some sense of common sense. And this is exactly what taste is about. Now, if that's the case, since Professor Gabriel's argument is strongly dependent upon the second critique of Kant, and Professor Woopen nicely raises the question, the question concerning the distinction between human being and animals. This conversation reminds me of what Jacques Derrida talks about animality and the ethics we all have toward the other, here represented by animals. So the thing is, I think, for me, maybe this is simply a very stupid misunderstanding. For me, your argument is Hegelian in some sense. When you talk about the way in which morality is always already self-grounding without any determined given ground, be it God, evolution, or reason. The thing I have concerning this very strong argument is that in your presentation, as well as in the question raised by Professor Woopen, both of you mentioned word context. And well, this is according to Jacques Derrida. I don't know if it's true. No context can be saturated, which means we in order to talk about context, we can always endlessly talk about what the context is or could be. Our disagreement is oftentimes not about the facts in a given context, rather maybe always about what kind of context we understand or we pre-understand. If that's the case, it seems that when we talk about moral facts, I don't want to criticize you for a sense of anthropocentrism, because I find it all right. Rather, it is problematic when you talk about things like sheer humanity, or this is also a phrase in Professor Woopen's presentation, It's like, allow me to repeat it. Human body will be substituted part by inorganic materials, as if we knew what inorganic means. So, well, I don't mean to be offensive, which means I'm offensive. This is also Jacques Derrida, who says, we are always already constituted by some prosthetic parts, like supplementary to what was taken to be our authentic body. Like I'm using this microphone. I have all these kind of items with me, which I can simply not do without. It seems that so you have all these machines and items and equipment, which seem to be other than the so-called ourselves, but we cannot do without. And these supplementary items, these small, trivial, insignificant, meaningless supplements, always already constitute our contexts, our daily life, in which we recognize whether it is correct or incorrect, morally correct or incorrect, politically correct or incorrect to do a certain thing. Like, right, the word political correctness is in itself morally laden. But we know a lot of things have happened over the past 3 years concerning what we call political correctness in the United States, as well as in Japan, maybe. So people argue about what is correct and what is incorrect, not in cases like whether we should save a child, but rather on the contrary, concerning cases more how to say, more dirty, more fuzzy, more complicated. And here I want to quote an example from Shakespeare and my speech. It is, as all of you may know, it is a very famous dialogue between Sherlock and his enemy in Merchant of Venice. And Sherlock, we know he's a Jew, and he was kind of he fell into a trap, right? And he kind of out of anger shouts something like, well, you share the blood with us. We are all human beings. We all eat when we are hungry. We all drink when we're thirsty. Why do you do things like this to me? The thing is, this kind of self-argument or self-defense is a strong kind of betrayal or even criticism of Judaism, if only because Judaism is all about this way of life, the manners you have to follow in your daily life. It is not about whether you are a human being or an animal. It is not about all these biological or physical facts about whom you are. Rather, it is about not spiritual, but what we call cultural. It is about what seems to be reducible to more elementary facts. It is about social artifacts. It is about supplements. It is about what we call simply constructed, subject to deconstruction, change, and transformation. It is about all these historical items which, to some extent, significantly make up what we call daily context and contextualization. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's my personal feeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei. Do you have any questions?
I want to come back to the question of the one who has to leave now.
I had to leave. Okay, I'll stay. Sorry.
No, but if you have to leave,
No,
from the
it's fine.
lecture
I can stay.
Because I thought your question was very good in pointing to the fact that people can err, can be wrong in their taste, in their habitus, in their attitudes, in their preferences, in the moral sense of the word, in the words, and what to do then. So in Nazi Deutschland, Nazi Germany, a lot of people were part of the party that supported Hitler's crimes. yeah, cruel crimes, and all of those who collaborated with him. And where is the authority? And then from an ethical point of view, we would say this was completely and fundamentally wrong. But where is the authority to say this? That is, law is not the authority, because the law was manipulated according to his worldview. But then ethics, at least according to my attitude to that, is above law. And it's another category to ask whether this law is ethically valid or not. But where the authority then to judge this and to bring this into reality? And that is the point where narratives come in and where values come in and so on, because it's only what we do together that can bring about anything and bring about any change. Yeah, so even if we are convinced that this ethical claim is right and the other one is a wrong one, the only thing we can bring this into reality is to act together. And that's our problem we face when talking about ethics, because there's no ethics court, no world court for ethics, no United Nations who have an ethics court. They have the International Criminal Court and so on, but there's no ethics court. And perhaps that's better, but perhaps we should nevertheless develop the international institutions to make ethics stronger. That's at least my conviction and my attitude, that we should develop international institutions to bring ethics more to the forefront of how we deal together, how we deal with each other, how we deal with the climate, how we deal with other people and different cultures and so on. So the only answer is that we are so brave, because sometimes this means that you really have to be brave to stand up against an existing law or a broad public attitude that you feel is wrong, and that you try to convince others, and that you are in a dialogue. Yeah, it seems a soft way, but I think it's the only way.
Oh, should I? Thank you very much. So I actually work in Hannah Arendt, and when you quoted Hannah Arendt, I was interested in that, because she talks about how there is, on the one hand, a sort of dialogical communitarian level, which is precisely based upon a sort of ethical or discursive, or shall we say taste. But also she mentions that there are certain levels of brute facts which simply are not beyond question, and that also has to be protected at all costs. And precisely the will to protect these facts comes from a discussion at the ethical level. So this might be a very hasty way of doing it, but to sort of perhaps surmise what you were talking about, perhaps there's a level of moral facts too, which is beyond discussion, but at the same time, there's something which is above and based on these moral facts, which are indisputable, but also need to be sort of, I don't know, thought together. And I guess that will be my way of sort of understanding all your talks together in this today. Sorry, that's all.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Christian, for very touching remark. So maybe the last question, if you have, okay.
Thank you very much for the illuminating lectures and debates so far. I'd like to ask Professor Gabriel one question concerning the grounding of moral facts. I mean, if my understanding is correct, the whole project of New Enlightenment or the ethical capitalism is based on the premise that the moral facts exist in the first place, and all of us can recognize them, right? And these moral facts are actually universally valid across all nations, cultures, eras, whatsoever, right? And time, yeah, eras means times, right? So, but how then do you think we can possibly explain to the others with different ethical values that their particular ethical norm is universal and that's moral fact, right? So, how do I say? I'm particularly interested in a situation where you cannot reach an agreement of whether or not a certain ethical norm is universal, right? So for instance, unfortunately, there might be someone who are not convinced by your argument that you must, by all means, try to save the drowning child instead of drinking alcohol, right? There might be someone. And in this kind of situation, how do you persuade those people and try to, reach an agreement? Obviously, you cannot turn to utility or social benefit like that, like a better world. Because as you said in a symposium at the Waseda University last week, I attended that, you cannot save the world because the world does not exist in the first place, right? So there exists absolutely no all-encompassing field of interest or utility, right? Just in the same way as the world does not exist. And in that case, there apparently there seems to be always someone whose interests are excluded from the, apparently all-encompassing campaign for the better future. And so how is it possible that we share the same moral facts and, reach an agreement in a situation where the shared humanities is apparently not shared at all? And yeah, that's my question.
Well, this is like also a version of, issue of context, but differently formulated, etc. Right? So the picture is one where, like imagine we know the moral fact. So I don't think that there's anyone, any culture, etc., who in the drowning child case would say, I don't get that. Of course, we would get the sake, right? That we can make those people up, but they don't exist, right? They would be anthropologically quite interesting, right? If someone, but the example is chosen. You can do more. There's evidence in the discipline of anthropology of ethics. Recent paper by Curry and others, 2019, which you find easily about. It's called Morality as Cooperation, and they did big studies. And so the examples like the drowning child, right, they extend very far, empirically speaking, right? It's much broader than we would think. It's something like, be nice to your family, treat elderlies well, etc. You can expand that. So there's a very broad range, anthropologically, empirically speaking, of shared humanity that has no relevant, with no relevant cultural parameter built into, right? It's much broader than one might assume from the outset, this recent evidence. But be that as it may, so let's just assume that. So that I think the drowning child case cannot be disputed. And if so, in this case, I don't have to convince anyone. I have to make sure, like that this person goes to prison, right? They didn't save the child, right? Or we should observe that person, right? So I should report the person to the police or find out what's wrong with them, right? There's no reason for further debate, right? Similarly with the Kremlin. If Putin comes in and he's like, look, we just have a different point of view on the Ukraine thing, right? You decadent Europeans, yada, yada, under the control of the Americans. So I'm at the, the Valdai conference, and he gives the speech about, liberalism, and it all sounds like super interesting. And then I say at the end, that sounded very interesting. You still kill children. By the way, the saving children thing is like, unfortunately, very everyday for everybody. So you're shooting Iskander rockets at children. How on earth is that stuff about NATO and borders, etc., in any way relevant to the question of whether you should trigger those rockets, right? That's like the Nietzsche point. So Putin starts dancing, and it's like, that's an ugly dance, right, in particular, but, you're out. That's not an argument. So there, I wouldn't even think of myself as being in an argument with someone who disagrees, right? Putin and I do not disagree on the crimes against humanity committed. He would also, like if you ask him, he knows, right? I mean, did you just deliberately shoot hyper fast rockets at private homes? And then he's like, is any camera on? It's like, no. It's like, of course I do this deliberately. I want to break them, I want to break their resistance. And then I would say, think about this, is this moral? And then he would say something like, whatever, strategic. But I think there's no disagreement. I don't think that Putin thinks that in his culture, etc. And if he thinks then we need to, that's one picture here of the error theory. then we need to get rid of the obstacle, right? So there's going to be some kind of ideology or propaganda involved that makes it look to him or to the majority of Russians, right? The absolute majority of Russians right now is, I will be as blunt as I can, evil. Just like the majority of Germans at a certain stage was evil. It's not the same thing. I'm not comparing Nazis to Germany. It's just the type of example. I could say this about many other. I could say this about Indonesia. Okay, so that's not the relevant comparison, though Nazi stuff is in the picture here, right? But that's not where the action should be, right, for the argument. And so it's fine to say that, right? And then there are difficult cases, of course, the one that you had, right? This severely disimpaired newborn infants, right? Plato thought you should throw them down cliffs, literally in the nomoi, in the laws, right? And so this is a widespread practice. Now, who gets it right? And they would say, well, in this case, we get it right that we don't do it. You know, like, because the beliefs that these people have, if you ask them, why do you do this, right? Then it's a bunch of superstition. I would say the same thing personally about the caste system, right? So, you know, why do you accept this level of poverty, etc.? And then there will be some say something about rebirth, and then we'll say, where's that coming from? And then they give me some confused quote in Sanskrit, and I would say that's just a confused justification. You know, let's sit down and talk this through, right? The Bhagavad Gita doesn't tell you that there should be poor people in Delhi. That's just a terrible reading of the Bhagavad Gita, right? So I would sit down and reason with them along those lines to get rid of the obstacle. Now, the point is not that I always get this right. In these cases, I know I'm right. But there are lots of cases where other people from other cultures, as the saying goes, right, get it right. So if you don't discuss with me about the specific details of trans people's rights, because I don't know enough about this, all I know is they have rights, and they should have more rights, and it's an important issue, apparently. People get nervous about this for good reasons, right? So I just trust that moral discourse. Don't ask me, ask them, right? I don't work in that field. So I'm certain that if you push me, you know, okay, let's do gender theory hardcore, you know, you push me, I will make mistakes. So I'm careful with judgment in that area because I don't know enough, right? So there are certainly people with a different culture, right? Whatever that means, will have to teach me something in an area where I don't get the moral facts, right? And I would definitely say I don't get them. And there are lots of things, you know, about human society and mutual mind reading, my favorite Japan example, where I'll be like, okay, there's probably lots of things that you get right in Japan and we get wrong in Germany about morality. I have no doubt about that. So the view is not of the form, just because I know that the war on Ukraine is evil, and that killing severely disimpaired children is evil, I therefore know everything, right? It's very important to be aware in the ethical realm that in every individual's and collective belief box, there are false beliefs. Every single one of us. Nobody gets morality right altogether. That's why conversation is constitutive of the process of finding the moral facts on the picture that I'm propounding. But I don't think that cultural difference goes as deep as someone might think when you think that this is where the action is. I think the disagreement about context problem is a harder one because it doesn't assume that contexts are cultures, etc. Right? So, but yeah, there are versions where one could get into trouble. But yeah, so I hope this is, you see the style of a response that it would get. It's like the position is a defeasibility one, right? I think precisely because ethics is objective, it's in the business of getting things right or wrong. So nobody is guaranteed to get things right. But if you got them right, then you got them right. So if I get something right, you know, Putin is evil, then I shouldn't worry about context. Like, you know, maybe I'm only thinking this because I'm in NATO, you know.
Okay, thank you. And now the time is over. So, and thank you again to Professor Max Gabriel and Professor Christian Woopen and O-sensei, and thanks to all during the symposium. Maybe the term New Enlightenment became much more attractive, much more clear, right? So it was really, really wonderful symposium. I'm so satisfied. So everyone, once again, please give a round of applause to the professors. Thank you. And please give a round of applause to the staff of EAA and the UTCP. Thank you. Thank you so much. So now we close the symposium. Thank you for coming. So